Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Russ Harrison, Director of Government Relations for IEEE-USA in Washington, D.C., and I welcome you to our October 2nd, 2020 legislative update. One of the joys of doing these updates every other week is that invariably I end up having to redo them Friday mornings because life keeps throwing interesting things at us. For this week, when I originally prepared my slides earlier this week, Monday and Tuesday, the expectation was the death of a Supreme Court justice, particularly someone of the prominence and importance of Ginsburg, would clearly dominate the news and dominate the information that I needed to convey out of Washington. Then life threw a curveball at us this morning, and we found out our president may have a life-threatening disease, which probably is a little bit more newsworthy. And so as a result, we're going to shift the focus of some of this talk today to talk about the president and talk a little bit about what it means. But also for October, which is traditionally a quiet time in Washington, particularly in a presidential election year, there's an awful lot going on. So we have quite a few things to talk about, and we will get right into it. Before I do, though, remind you, if you have questions, you can put them in the little chat function or put them up on the comment section in YouTube or whatever else you're watching this on, and we'll try to rotate back to them at the end of the presentation. So as I mentioned, Justice Ginsburg did pass away on September 18th. IEEE-USA expresses our condolences to her family and friends. She, of course, was a titan here in Washington for a very long time and was an unusually personable and open Supreme Court justice. They frequently kind of maintained their distance here in Washington, but she did not. And she touched an awful lot of people's lives and, of course, had a distinguished career of public service for our country, which we honor. The jostling to replace her and the political maneuvering to replace her started almost immediately upon hearing of her death. The president has named a replacement, Amy Coney Barrett, a judge and former law professor from Notre Dame. We'll hear much more about her in the next couple weeks, but today we'll focus on Justice Ginsburg and the loss to the country from her passing. The question then is, what does this do to IEEE-USA and the upcoming Supreme Court fight? The first is that October has become much more complicated for IEEE-USA and our legislative priorities. We had expected to have this month to have quiet conversations with Hill staff that are still around. A lot of them are out trying to make sure their bosses keep their job. But a lot of them stay in the city, and this is a great time to have long-term, conversations about long-term planning. What are we going to do after the election, but also, in January and in February? How do we start to think about how to move legislation that we haven't been able to get traction on, and have kind of those planning discussions, which we now cannot have. Legislators are coming back. The Senate will be back in session to do hearings probably mid-month. And we expect it to be quite contentious and not really conducive to quiet long-term conversations. Now, something has already happened since the justice's death, which is interesting. There was speculation immediately after Ginsburg's death that the Democrats would use the opportunity of the fiscal 21 budget to start to delay things. They had a little bit of leverage over the Republicans in that they could shut down the government if the president didn't delay naming a replacement until after the election, or even punt it till next year. But that did not happen. The House passed the fiscal 21 budget earlier in September. The Senate passed it towards the end of September, but after Ginsburg's passing, and the president has since signed it into law. Now, that is not the full budget, as we'll talk about later. That's just a continuing resolution, but it happened and it moved smoothly, and it was not a partisan decision. So at least some pieces of the government are still functioning well. What is more likely to be impacted is the COVID negotiations for the next COVID relief bill. Now, those negotiations appeared to have a little bit of life earlier this week. but I'm still not convinced anything's actually happening. And when they get down to actually negotiating, probably after the election, I expect those negotiations to be really unpleasant, and it makes it much less likely that anything's going to happen. Ginsburg's death highlights what we've seen over the last probably 20 years, where the Senate is increasingly becoming House-like. And what I mean by that is, in the House, the two parties don't work together typically. The House is a dictatorship of the majority. Whichever party has one more vote in the chamber basically runs the whole thing, and the other party can complain and whine, but there's not a lot they can do about very much. Traditionally, the Senate has behaved differently. Traditionally, the Senate was much more collegial. Senators are around for a lot longer. They were able to work together and work across party lines. And, the structure of the Senate respected the power and relevance of the minority, most especially through the filibuster. Well, for the last 20 years and accelerating in the last 5, that hasn't been the case. Inter-party cooperation has been much harder to find. These really contentious Supreme Court battles don't help. And I suspect next year we'll start to see the Senate more openly structure itself more along the lines of the House, in terms of whichever party has a majority gets to run the whole show, and showing less deference for the minority party, which is probably unfortunate, but it will make the chamber work more efficiently. So efficiency isn't really the hallmark of a successful democracy, but that is at least a little bit of an upside. Then we have the news that President Trump has tested positive for COVID, as has his wife. And of course, IEEEUSA wishes them both well and hope for a speedy recovery. As you all know, one of the quirks of COVID, most people that test positive do not have particularly bad symptoms. Most people that have bad symptoms recover. But of course, the president is in his 70s, and that puts him in the high-risk category. And so we won't know for several days if he has it or if this is a real problem. There's a lot of speculation online and other places on what this all means. I think this is probably bad for the president's reelection prospects, although it's not clear how bad it will be. And of course, if, Senator Biden was hanging out with President Trump just a few days ago, so we'll have to wait to see if that becomes a problem as well. This so far incredibly bizarre year could become much more bizarre if President Trump, God forbid, were to have a very bad case of COVID. It shines the spotlight on Vice President Pence. And if Senator Biden were to get COVID, it would shine a bright spotlight on Vice Presidential candidate Harris, which would lead to a very, very entertaining and interesting election in what has already been a disturbingly interesting year. So then I have this lovely slide about the political update, which is probably not relevant anymore. We have 32 days till the election. That is true. The debate schedule, I have no idea what's going on with that. The vice presidential debate will probably happen since neither candidate has COVID. The second presidential debate on October 15th, I think is less likely at this point. October 22nd, we'll have to see how the president does. If either campaign wanted to avoid the debates, they now have an excuse. I don't think President Trump wants to avoid the debate. He seems to like them. He likes that sort of environment. Senator Durbin, perhaps, Senator Biden, perhaps less so. But if either party wanted to pull out, they now have an excuse. And we'll have to see if they do that. Of course, if the president is symptomatic, he can't debate in a traditional way. You just can't have two guys on stage yelling at each other if one of them has COVID. And so there'll have to be a change. I mean, a virtual debate, I suppose we could do that. They could be in different rooms, I suppose. You could put a wall up between them. There's things you could do, but certainly I think the debate schedule will change and the political schedule will have to be adjusted accordingly. I want to make a point, though, about IEEE's and IEEEUSA's role in all of this election stuff. IEEEUSA maintains an aggressive, nonpartisan stance here in Washington. That as an organization, we do not endorse political candidates. We will not endorse political candidates. We see it as a bad decision to endorse political candidates. IEEEUSA supports every political candidate that the American people see fit to send to Washington. We do not judge, and we simply go with whomever we have to work with. IEEEUSA is proud to have allies on our political agenda on the extreme right, the extreme left, and every place in between. And we intend to maintain an impartial status so that we can keep doing that. Obviously, IEEE members are Democrats and IEEE members are Republicans, and we encourage those of you who see themselves on one side or another to do that and to work with the team that you feel more comfortable with. But as an organization, we are nonpartisan and proud of it. So as I mentioned earlier, the fiscal 21 budget, it's not done, but they've punted through a CR so that the government will stay open until at least December 11th. The CR runs out on December 11th. They can do another one till the 18th, which is basically Christmas, and they're not going to go beyond that. Or they can just punt until next year and let the next Congress deal with it. There seems to be a little appetite rather for shutdown of the federal government. For our budgets, we don't expect dramatic changes, given that Congress is waiting so long to do it. There's not going to be a lot of big shifts in money. We will probably see some additional money for research. We could see quite a bit of additional money for research. More on that in a minute. There's also a move to get several $billion, $20 to $30 billion, in new money for the universities to help them deal with COVID and all the problems they're experiencing. That could be in a COVID relief bill or a standalone bill. They're actually talking about a standalone bill or putting in the budget at this point, giving up hope on the COVID bill. There could be additional funds for NASA, more on that in a bit, and funds for things like cybersecurity and some of the other tech challenges facing the government. So we're optimistic, and we don't see any major cuts in any of our programs at this point, but we have some opportunities for some nice bumps as well. COVID relief bill, there's not much of an update here from last time. The two parties are again talking. Apparently, the White House and the House House Democratic leaders are talking. I don't see any reason to be optimistic about those talks at this point. The sticking points are the same as before, the overall size of the bill, which is really just a proxy for some of the other issues. But unemployment relief, how much there will be. The president extended unemployment relief through an executive order last month. That will run out eventually, and it's smaller than what people used to enjoy. Now, the overall unemployment rate dropped again today, but it is still, of course, very high. There's a talk of extending, broadening, changing the PPP program, which was very popular and very successful. But a lot of the companies that got those PPP loans that have since become grants were reaching the point at which they're allowed to start laying people off again. And so there's talk about re-upping it in one way or another. But the big sticking point remains state and local aid. The Republicans are okay with some state and local aid, but they don't want to do a huge amount. They're willing to pay for part of the COVID expenses, but they're not willing to bail states that were already having budget problems out of decisions that were made 20 or 30 years ago. The issue with the state and local aid is the number is so huge that that's kind of the debate. And if they could reach resolution on that, they could probably work the other numbers out. But so far, there's been no movement on that issue. We may see this after the election, depending on what the economy does. But with the economy continuing to improve, the pressure to do this drops. And again, that's the issue that's the sticking point. NDAA update. Again, not a lot to report here. Conversations are continuing. IEEEUSA is part of some of those conversations. We expect the formal conference committee. Now, we had expected the conference committee to be announced probably right around the election, maybe right after the election. The fact that the Senate is back in session because of the Supreme Court increases the odds that the conferees will be named sooner than that. I mean, they're here. When they're not yelling about the Supreme Court, they can actually do other work. And so they might do that. It's still unlikely, but they still may do it. Still on track to have a bill by December. And that's what everybody expects. The AI amendments that we had worked to have added to the NDAA are still there, are in a very good shape. We're getting good support from both sides of the aisle and both chambers of Congress. So Republicans and Democrats in both chambers are broadly supportive of it. We've worked with a couple senators that had some problems, and they seem to be on board. The CHIPS Act to bring manufacturing back into this country seems to be in good shape as well. Hasn't really seen much opposition to it. The Endless Frontier Act is a different story. We have heard from staff that it will not be included in the NDAA, but instead will become a bigger bill in the next Congress. And we've also heard from staff that it will be included in the NDAA. That is not uncommon at these kind of staff level discussions. But unlike the other two sets of amendments, the Endless Frontier Act is not a guarantee and could easily be left out of the final version of the bill. We continue to do outreach through key states, getting some good letters of support from local IEEE sections into Congress, which has been very effective, as well as working directly with legislators and their staff on all of these issues. We're not going to see any clarity on this probably until after the election, but probably before Thanksgiving. A little update on visa news. The Department of Homeland Security has issued new proposed rules. These aren't in place yet. Proposed rules on student visas. We kind of knew these were coming. They had telescoped the fact that these were going to come up. But now we have an actual proposal. Currently, student visas are unlimited. So long as you are in a academic program, you can stay for as long as you want. Excuse me. The new rules would limit student visas to 4 years, although they're renewable, so you could renew them periodically. There are restrictions on visas from a set of countries that have very high overstay rates. Those are situations where people get a student visa, come into this country, and then basically just disappear. The government actually makes no attempt to track people that are in this country legally on a visa. And so if they just simply don't leave, the government generally doesn't find them. And there are certain countries where 40 to 50% or more of their students simply stay at the end of their visas. And so there's going to be some additional restrictions on those countries moving forward. There's also some restrictions on students that come here to study English. They're limited to 2 years. And restrictions on students' abilities to change programs. And this isn't, if you're in a 4-year program to get a bachelor's degree and after 2 years you switch to another school, that's not a problem. The issue is if you are in a 4-year program and after 3 years you switch to another program where you start over, and then after 3 years you switch to another program where you start over. Those sort of serial students, there'll be some crackdown on their ability to perpetually renew these visas. I don't see this as being having a huge impact on most IEEE students, but we'll have to watch it and see particularly how it's implemented, whether it's a real problem or not. Interesting news out of the Department of Labor. The Department of Labor, and if you see them, this is the actual rule. This is kind of what they look like. Has issued, again, it's a proposed rule, getting at the question of how do you tell who is an employee and who is a contractor. This is a legal question that is creating increased angst across the country because of California's AB 5. AB 5 was passed last year, so it's been in effect for almost a full year now. So here's the deal. U.S. employment law assumes a standard employee-employer relationship. You work for someone for a certain number of hours, and they pay you a certain amount of money. And U.S. law has a number of protections in place, predominantly to protect workers from employers that don't pay them or treat them wrong or mistreat them or whatever. All of which is good, except that independent contractors are outside of that structure. And there's been a number of attempts over the years to give independent contractors certain legal rights and protections similar to those of regular employees. The problem is, this was done in a set of laws passed by Congress starting in the 1940s and going up through the 1980s, which deal with pieces of the issue. But there's never been a piece of legislation that kind of settles the matter. And so it left to courts to kind of figure out how this was all going to work. And they've done, there's a number of decisions that try to get at this question, which work to a greater or lesser extent. AB 5 was an attempt in California to codify one of these court decisions into actually all-encompassing legal language defining definitively who is a contractor and who is not. The problem is that's really hard to do. There's a massive difference between an aerospace contractor that builds spaceships, the contracts with companies to build a particular piece of a spaceship and then goes away, and an Uber driver. And so given the complexity of relationships between employers and kind of employees, the fact that we don't have a good set of rules is both a problem and also understandable. The DOL, Department of Labor, is trying to reconcile all of this by creating a new set of rules that more definitively defines who is a contractor and who is not. Unlike AB5, the Department of Labor started with the laws. And like I said, we have a bunch of different laws that have rules about this, but they're not cohesive. It's not one big system, it's pieces of systems. So DOL has proposed a set of regulations to try to unify those laws and create a more comprehensible system, definitive system, that can draw some bright lines between employee and contractor. My read of the regulations is it doesn't do that, but it comes close. It sets up some nice criteria which should be more useful in determining who is a contractor and who isn't, and should give some clarity to the question. Basically, it tries to set some bright lines in terms of how much control contractors have over their workforce, their work conditions rather. Do they have to work set hours? Do they have to work in set places? There's a question of who pays for training of the contractors. If the contractor is paying for their own training, they probably are a contractor, whereas if the company they're working with pays for training, they're probably an employee. So a lot of those bright lines, some of which are useful, some of which aren't. Obviously, one of the rules the DoD focuses on looks at where the work has to be performed. And if the work can be performed anywhere, and in fact, the contractor has the option of deciding where to work, then they're probably a contractor. The problem is if you're working on really advanced technology like spaceships, like satellites, like supercomputers, you're not going to do that from your apartment. You're going to have to go to the facility. So it's not as helpful for some of our guys as others. But it's worth looking at. In general, it makes it easier to be a contractor than AB5 does, and the PRO Act, which is the federal legislation that would enact AB5 over all the country. Comments on these and the visa rules are due at the end of October, and IEEE-USA is planning on commenting. I don't know exactly what we're going to say yet. I'm working with IEEE members, particularly in California, to figure out what we want from these rules. A bit of good news, exciting news, frankly. The administration has released Project Artemis, which is their kind of start to get a concrete plan to get people back to the moon by 2024, which is kind of cool and exciting. We are especially excited and happy about the role that commercial space will play in Artemis. They do have a role there. We think commercial space should have a bigger role in the whole process. But mostly we're just glad that the administration is getting serious about space. Instead of just sending rockets up to see what we can do, we have a plan, we have an objective, which is helpful, and we seem to be on track to put the first woman and the next man on the moon before the end of 2024. If you'd like to read Project Artemis, the link is there, nasa.gov/specials/Artemis. It's a pretty slick presentation, some good ideas in there, and we're excited to be part of it. And with that, our next update will be October 16th. That should be right in the heart of the yelling and screaming about the Supreme Court, so that's exciting. We should also have much more clarity on the presidential debate situation and possibly the presidential election itself. And again, enter your questions in. And before I go to those questions, remind you, I'm Russ Harrison, Director of Government Relations, IEEE-USA. My phone number is 202-530-8326. My email address is r.t.harrison@ieee.org. Got some good follow-up last week from a few of you through email. Feel free to reach out if you have any questions about today, any questions that come up before the 16th. I'll be happy to work with you and answer them. And with that, I will look to see if we have questions. Mark Milliman has commented correctly that the CR is not a budget. He's right about that. It is, of course, merely an expression that the government should continue to spend money at the same rate they were spending money in September when we were still in fiscal 2020. Pardon me. So while Mark is technically true, it does function like a budget in that it informs government agencies how much they are allowed to spend and gives them permission to keep spending. And so while the CR doesn't say what those budget levels are, it does effectively create a formula for determining them. And so it does function as though it were the budget. But yes, Mark, you are correct. It is not a budget. It is just a legal tweak to allow the government to stay open. Don, good to hear from you. How does the money in the CHIPS Act compare to what China is subsidizing for foundries? Well, Don, as I'm sure you know, the fun part about that question is we don't actually know what China's doing. We have their official accounts, but I don't think anybody takes those seriously. The CHIPS Act, in either way, has less money than what China is spending. The betting here is that companies will repatriate chip manufacturing because this is a better country to operate in, because we have better legal protections, both for contracts and most importantly for intellectual property. And so that we don't have to spend the same level of money to get those facilities back in this country as China needs to spend to keep them here. But of course, China's goal is not to have American companies building chips in China, but rather to have Chinese companies building chips in China, which gets to the research side of things. There is money in the CHIPS Act for research, but that is not where most of the money for research is found. We spend money in other pots. There are a number of proposals, particularly the Endless Frontier Act, that try to invest money comparable to what China is spending on basic research. Like I said, those provisions may or may not be part of the NDAA when it passes. It may or may not be part of the budget at the end of the year. But what we're seeing from both parties is an awareness that we need to do something. And increased spending on research, particularly in technology, seems to be on the agenda for the end of this year and next year. I'm not sure we can keep up with China, but then again, our research efforts are more efficient than China. So whether we can keep up with them on a budget is one question. Whether we can keep up with them in terms of actual, research and discoveries is quite another. I think if we get serious about it, we can keep up with them. But we got to make sure Congress gets serious about them. And that is all the questions I can see on my screen. If you've placed a question online, I will circle back to that this afternoon and try to respond to you. As always, 202-530-8326 or r.t.harrison@ieee.org. I want to thank you all for joining us. Hope you're all safe. Your families are safe and healthy as we head into fall, and I look forward to joining you again in 2 weeks. Thank you very much.